Hello, everyone. My name is Kendra Brooks, and I am a council member and the minority leader for Philadelphia City Council. I'm so proud to be a member and to serve on a board of Local Progress. We are a network of local elected officials advancing a racial and economic justice agenda through all levels of local government. We are collectively reshaping what is possible in localities across the country. I came to Philadelphia City Council with lived experience of housing insecurity. I'm a mother and I'm a grandmother. I'm from an area called Nicetown, a working class neighborhood that has survived decades of redlining, disinvestment, and that now is seeing signs of real estate speculation and gentrification. We have a system that allows corporate landlords to squeeze every last penny out of working families and then throw them to the curb as if they can't pay. Here in Philadelphia, much of my work in council has sought to stabilize housing and keep more families in their homes. Last year, I passed legislation that made permanent our city's acclaimed eviction diversion program, which was dramatically reduce evictions in our city. Local Progress has a resource about this program, which you will find on their website. After a woman was shot during an eviction, I also passed a law that resulted in the end of Philadelphia's for-profit eviction system. In our most recent budget, I secured $34 million in rental assistance for Philadelphia families. These victories would have been unthinkable just 10 years ago, but they earned broad support in Philadelphia amongst legislators and the general public because people see that the housing crisis is getting worse and they're hungry for real solutions. This housing crisis creates an opportunity for us as progressives to propose bold solutions that lead the way on solving one of our most pressing problems. That's why I'm so excited to be joining you all in this conversation about social housing. I have lived most of my life here in Philadelphia, but I was born in New York and spent some of my childhood in Rochdale Village, which is a housing cooperative in Queens. We had everything we needed in our neighborhood: schools, parks, markets, a public library. And I grew up feeling like I belonged to a community where people's needs were more important than landlords' profits. I want that kind of community to be here in Philadelphia. And I know it's possible because I've lived it. I've seen it in action in other cities. Last year, I visited Vienna and Berlin to study social housing with Local Progress and PowerSwitch Action. And what I saw was amazing. Mixed income communities with childcare, healthcare, transportation, and a range of convenient resources that every family needs. But Europe is not the only place with successful examples of social housing. And that's what we're going to hear about from our panelists today. We have social housing taking root and growing in cities across the United States. We have coalitions of renters and homeowners, young people and senior citizens, legal experts, local elected officials who are working together to make this vision a reality. I know the new administration in the White House is causing a lot of uncertainty and fear. That's exactly why we need to lead with local policies that deliver for working families and offer a better vision for our communities. It is up to us to bring that better vision and build the support to make it a reality. What exactly are we talking about with the term social housing? The principle is simple: housing that exists and is built to fulfill the basic human need, that to be sheltered rather than to exist as a vehicle for profit. Create and maintain homes for what they are: housing and shelter. This also means that we're thinking of housing and the component of housing through the lens of what's going to make the residents thrive. What components will meet the needs of the inhabitants? and put that in the forefront rather than question that has long been governing housing. What components can I add that will provide me profit? This report covers the problem, the way social housing can be tooled in our housing crisis, and examines 10 jurisdictions in the United States that explore social housing. Who's here? We're joined by folks from all over the country. It is empowering to see so many of you engage in this movement towards a housing system that works for us all. So let's get started. You guys can see the agenda, how we got here, the principles of social housing, the overview of the policies in the report, a case study of Seattle social housing developer, and we'll have an amazing Q&A at the end. Housekeeping. This call will be recorded and made available to attendees after the meeting. We'll have a Q&A at the end. Feel free to send your questions as they arise to local progress staff, and they will be monitoring the chat and pulling questions for our Q&A portion. Next, I would like to pass it to our panelists, Christina Rosales and Tram Hong. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this conversation today. And thank you to all the folks on the tech and coordination side at Local Progress for making this possible. We were overwhelmed with the amount of interest we got in this webinar, so it tells us that folks are looking for inspiration at this moment. Please consider this hour and ongoing work as an invitation to join the movement, to collaborate, and to build deeply with us and one another. My name is Christina Rosales, and I'm Housing and Land Justice Director at PowerSwitch Action. We're a national network with affiliates across the country, and we support all these affiliates in campaigns that make our economy and communities more just, feminist, and powerful in the face of corporate influence. Next slide, please. I want you to take 30 seconds and imagine yourself kicking your shoes off as you get home, cozy up on the couch with a blanket, and you feel at ease in your home and in your community. Maybe take a deep breath and picture it. What has made you feel at ease? Maybe you're not stretched paying the rent or mortgage. Maybe you had an easy commute home from work. Maybe you were able to go for a walk in a safe, beautiful neighborhood. Or maybe your neighbor just dropped off some homemade soup as repayment to you for helping babysit their kid. That sounds cute, yeah? About a century ago, these are the kinds of things that housers intended to happen in our housing system. Folks organizing around housing for all people were up against similar things that we face today. Housing was far too expensive to build. Conditions for housing for low-wage workers and families were unsafe and unsanitary, and that's if you were lucky enough to find a place to live. Back then, there wasn't nearly enough housing for the growing populations of our cities. But deep crises sometimes lead to innovation, imagination, and opportunity. Housers in the US were inspired by some European cities' massive municipal investment in land and housing construction. For example, in Vienna, the city invested in land and built holistic communities with childcare, post offices, libraries, and other shared goods. After the Great Depression in the US, there was federal funding to do this kind of community building via the Public Works Administration. There were experiments like this one, which you're seeing on your screen. This isn't Vienna. This is the Carl Mackley houses in Philadelphia, built with New Deal funding and sponsored by the Hosiery Workers Labor Union. It had a swimming pool, wading pool, roof terraces, play yard, nursery school, kindergarten, library, 5 stores, a print shop, carpentry shop, craft room, and an auditorium. If building community and enriching people's lives is the priority, this is what's possible for our housing. Next slide. When it came time to make federal housing funding permanent in the 1930s, real estate banks and insurance industries saw a threat. You see, if the public invests in housing that is beautiful and doesn't center the profit of private corporations, there's less money to make for the industries. So the industry worked against the houser movement to create the two-tiered system that we know today, the one driven by profit for the wealthy and housing for the middle class, and the housing of last resort for the poor. They limited the public investment that can go into public housing and made it punitive for the people who lived there. Since then, the problem of housing insecurity hasn't gone away, and as the solution has been devolved to developers and investors, we now see the real estate state. That is, the industry frames what's possible, and without much resistance, our homes, our solutions end up fitting into what works for the industry's bottom lines. Think about tax credits and vouchers that go to private landlords as opposed to massive direct public investment in housing that is desirable and that centers humans. Next slide. All right, so how do we respond? What do we do? Here's the thing, we can't remake the housing economy that has been constructed by the industry in 4 years, or even 10 years, or 15 years. But we can seize on the crisis to imagine and experiment with housing that serves the public good. So instead of promoting and advancing real estate's co-governance of our communities, we can shift our goals for housing so that communities are co-governing and determining what the next 100 years of housing looks like. I'm going to pass to my colleague Tram to talk about some of those experiments that we looked at for this toolkit that begin to do just that.
Thanks, Christina. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks to Local Progress and PowerSwitch Action for being such amazing partners and collaborators. We're really proud of the social housing report that we've co-created together and are excited to share it with you all. So my name is Tram Huang. I'm a senior associate on the housing team at PolicyLink, where we work on a variety of housing and land justice issues ranging from fair housing, anti-displacement, to tenant protections, and spatial reparative justice, all of which are, of course, related to social housing. So if you haven't read the report yet, I'm going to be providing a quick overview of what you can expect in it. And I'll start first with the principles of social housing. So as you all have probably seen across many different coalitions and reports, social housing has been defined by many different organizations and groups across the country, even across the world. And the set of principles that we use to compare social housing policies in this report are inspired by all of those definitions. So the set of 8 principles that we used are here on this slide, and I'll go through them really briefly. So the first one is ownership. It's a question of who owns the housing that is produced or preserved by this policy. Does the policy prioritize collective ownership or public ownership? And does it ensure long-term community benefits? The second is community control, and that can range from building level to program level to community level. But how much influence do residents and community members have over the housing, whether that's the development process or the way property is managed or tenant protections that exist there? How are they involved in decision making or governing, and even maintaining the housing over time? Decommodification and affordability term is another one we talk about, which is answers the question, how well is the housing insulated from the private real estate market and market pressures? And related to that, how long is the housing affordable for? And what are the mechanisms that ensure long-term affordability? You know, are these ground leases? Are these deeds? So answers the question of how do we keep things affordable and for how long? Then we have income targeting and cost burden, which is the question of who the housing is affordable to and how does the policy address cost burden for lower income households. As we know, our current system is very much focused on AMI, meaning that someone who qualifies for 50% AMI housing may earn much less than that. So at the end of the day, even though they have, quote, affordable rent, they are still overwhelmingly cost burdened. The next principle we talk about is tenant protection. So what protections are built into social housing policies and programs to ensure long-term stability for tenants? Oftentimes, these protections can exist at the state or local level, but in many places, very few tenant protections exist. So how are the ways that we can build in tenant protections into social housing programs? And then we have anti-discrimination. The question of how well does the housing or social housing program combat the lingering discriminatory effects of past housing policies and practices in a way that not only reduces disparity, but also promotes equity and creates holistic communities, like Christina mentioned earlier. And then we have the question of finance. So how is the housing financed? Does it rely on private loans that require repayment of interest? Is it dependent on public financing? And then lastly, we have a principle that we've called building for people and planet. So it's not just the process of who gets to use the housing at the end, but it's also the process of developing the housing. Are there elements of sustainability and responsible labor practices incorporated into the development of the housing? And does the policy prioritize environmental health and resource efficiency? I think we're all very aware of the climate impacts of housing development and the ways that we can make our housing more resilient to our ever-changing world. So as you've noticed, these principles are incredibly difficult to fight for, whether you've tried to fight for long-term affordability in your community or tenant protections. These fights are not only hard to wage, but they're hard to win in the private market. And it's because, like Christina said, the lack of these principles is exactly what makes our current private housing market possible. And it actually upholds our current private housing market, right? So community control would not result in the displacement and extraction of wealth from our neighbors that we witness every day. That's why social housing is an incredibly important part of the solution to our housing crisis and central to the vision that communities across the country and across the world have set forth for a better future for us all. So we'll go to the next slide. We also recognize that social housing is a very broad spectrum of different models of housing, from community land trust to tenant acquisition of buildings to limited equity cooperatives. So for this report, we decided to focus on a very specific and narrow scope of social housing policies, and that was policies that were advanced at the local and state level. So in this report, you'll see policies and programs that have been passed and implemented, such as ones in Atlanta, Montgomery County, San Francisco, and Seattle. And then in the next slide, you'll see policies that have been passed and the details of implementation are currently being worked out, such as in the state of California and the cities of Chicago and Los Angeles. And then lastly, next slide, we include jurisdictions in which social housing policies have been proposed and are awaiting passage, such as New York State, Rhode Island, and the District of Columbia. So that's a little sneak peek of what you can see in the report. Of course, I encourage you all to read it if you have not already and share it with your communities as a resource. And without further ado, I'll kick it back to Christina, who is going to facilitate a wonderful conversation with one of the folks playing a huge role in leading the movement for social housing in Seattle.
Slight miscommunication. We're passing it to Kendra for this facilitation.
All right, thanks so much, Christina and Trom, for the overview. I'm now excited to introduce Suresh Chamugam, who we are joined today out of Seattle. Suresh is a software engineer of 25 years who volunteers with Tech for Housing, an organization that works to ensure Seattle is affordable for everyone. He also serves on the campaign steering committee for House Our Neighbors, an organization that advocates and mobilizes for policy to realize social housing for residents of Seattle and beyond. And now I'll turn it over to Suresh.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Brooks. And thank you to all the organizations putting this together and everyone who's taking time to come learn about social housing. I would love to tell you about the Seattle Social Housing Developer. This is the logo for the Public Development Authority that was created recently. And maybe let's jump to the next slide here. So first, to really emphasize, I am just a volunteer with the 501c4 political advocacy organization House Our Neighbors that created the Seattle social housing movement. So I want to tell you a bit about the people who started this movement in Seattle. They're here in the upper right-hand corner. That's Ty Reed and Tiffany McCoy. They co-founded House Our Neighbors 4 years ago in 2021. They initially put together this very broad coalition to oppose a corporate-backed voter initiative called Charter Amendment 29 in Seattle that would have enshrined um, sweeps of homeless encampments into the city's constitution, its charter. Um, and yeah, next slide. Um, After successfully getting Charter Amendment 29 removed from the ballot, they then turned to this very broad coalition they put together and said, what can we do that's positive? How can we actually house all of our neighbors? So in, I think, late March of 2022, they filed a voter initiative in Seattle, I-135, and this was legislation to create a public development authority chartered with creating, operating, and maintaining social housing in Seattle, and enshrined in the charter of this PDA. And just a reminder to folks, a PDA is like if a government agency and a nonprofit had a baby. It's a quasi-governmental institution, separate enough from our government that it can operate independent like a company, but completely removed from profit motive, and it is owned by the public. In the charter of I-135, is a requirement for this PDA to uphold all of the principles of social housing that you saw earlier today in this presentation. I'll go through a few highlights. It's publicly owned in perpetuity. So the land, the buildings that this PDA, this housing developer creates, will always remain in the ownership of the people and can never be sold off, which is or revert to market rate housing, which happens so often in the complex web of subsidized housing that we have in the United States today. Critically important, it is permanently affordable to the families living in social housing, so no one can ever be evicted for financial reasons from housing operated by the Seattle social housing developer. It uses the pay what you can model. Rents are capped by law, or should be capped at 30% of a family's income. If your income drops to zero, and that happens to many families sometimes, your rent will be zero. And it's free from market speculation. We've taken the profit motive out of it. And probably most critically, particularly for this audience, is we are building cross-class communities in this housing. So a very wide range of incomes can enter into this housing, anyone earning from 0 to 120% of the area median income. And if you do better, if you move into this housing and your income goes up because you're no longer commuting an hour each way in and out of the city and no longer paying so much for childcare, you can stay, even if your income goes above that. And this is so critical because in Seattle, we have a stark gap in wages between white and black families. White families in Seattle earn roughly twice to 3 times what the median black family earns in Seattle. And that, coupled with our private housing market, results in racial segregation of our city, our neighborhoods, and our schools. Seattle schools are as deeply segregated today as they were when Brown versus Board was decided. I'll also make a note, this is not on the slide, that the social housing developer is required by law to practice restorative justice. And you can imagine, like if I moved into social housing and I heard my neighbor every morning at 5 a.m. all of a sudden making noise and cooking and stuff like that. In private market housing, I might call the police and say, file a noise complaint. The Seattle social housing developer uses resident-led processes within each building and restorative justice. And they might say, hey, there are large immigrant communities here in Seattle who are Muslim, and this is Ramadan. They're waking up early and cooking, just like when your sister visits from New York and their kids are on East Coast time and running up and down the halls at 5 a.m. Let's find a way that reduces the harm to all of us and make sure that we can all continue living with each other and understand each other. So yeah, this is such an important, it's not just an economic progress, but really building more sustainable and integrated communities. So let's move on to the next slide and say what happened. So a lot of hard work, thanks to our mascot Housie. We gathered 26,000 valid signatures, got I-135 on the ballot. It passed by a resounding 57% to 42%, 14-point margin. There's a tie celebrating on election night, February 14th, 2023. So that created this social housing developer. And let's move on to the next slide. So how does this work now that this developer has been created? And I'll note it doesn't yet operate any housing. It's still fairly young. It has appointed its 13-member board, and I'll say that 7 out of 13 members of the board, slightly more than half, are residents of the housing. Right now, since it doesn't operate any housing, the Seattle's Renters Commission has appointed 7 people who rent their homes in Seattle to serve on the board. And the city of Seattle is required by law to provide 18 months of in-kind and administrative support so it can hire a CEO and a CFO. The city is required to evaluate if any excess land that it's being giving away or not using could be sold to the social housing developer. And the city and our elected leaders could have funded the developer right now to actually start building or acquiring housing through tax revenue or by issuing bonds. The city has excess debt capacity, but it has not done that yet. Yeah, let's move on to the next slide to see what Housing Neighbors is doing to address that. First I'll note that the Seattle social housing developer has hired a CEO, Roberto Jimenez, who has a multi-decade track record of building subsidized housing, primarily in California. Yeah, he's just absolutely incredible and has been on the job for a few months and really amazing leadership there. So yeah, let's move on to see what Housing Our Neighbors is doing now. Right, so this is why Ty Reed and Tiffany are not speaking to you today. House Our Neighbors is running a voter initiative. Ballots are actually going out right now. Collected 26,000 signatures last year for I-137, which taxes wealthy businesses to fund the Seattle social housing developer. So I-137 taxes a business anytime it pays an individual in Seattle more than $1 million a year. And it's a marginal tax on the amount over $1 million. So the new CEO of Starbucks, who's flying in every week to Seattle, I think his compensation is so high that Starbucks will be paying about $4 million a year on this payroll tax. It's the employer, not the employee, and it's just per individual employee who does work in Seattle and is paid more than $1 million, including stock grants and bonuses. It's not imposed on a business that has a total payroll of over $1 million. It's anytime a business pays any individual more than $1 million. That money goes to the Seattle social housing developer. Should bring in about $50 million a year, depending on who the Mariners sign this year, and should allow, I'll pause for everyone to laugh at that, and should allow the Seattle social housing developer to create about 200 units a year of mixed income, permanently affordable, resident-led social housing. And then you may have noticed that we haven't had much support from our elected leaders with this social housing movement. In Washington State, when a voter initiative collects enough signatures to qualify for the ballot, the appropriate legislative body can put an alternative on the ballot next to it. So I-137 is on the ballot today as Prop 1A, and the City Council put an alternative Prop 1B next to it, which does not raise any new revenue. It allocates a small amount of money, about $10 million to the social housing developer, but because it's not raising any new revenue, it defunds other programs, and it also imposes a bunch of restrictions on the money, such as it can only be used for construction or acquisition of units that are housing families earning less than 80% of the area median income. But you can earn $120,000 a year in Seattle, which is about 120% AMI, and not afford to raise a family here because it is so unbelievably and staggeringly expensive. So yeah, Prop 1A is on the ballot. So right now, ballots were mailed out today. And let's go on to the next slide. I think that the ballot ends February 11th. So you might have seen that this was largely people-powered grassroots movement and not enacted through our elected leaders. For those of you who are in elected office but find yourself in a minority, here are some ways that you can create social housing in your community, in your jurisdiction. Obviously, you want to check on what is possible to be enacted via voter initiative in your community, but you should plan on about 2 years from inception to election date. You really need to focus a lot on grassroots fundraising, so you can afford to hire a lawyer to draft legislation. Gathering signatures through volunteers is incredibly time consuming. And it's very, very, very important to carefully craft the messaging to the public on social media and in op-eds and when news interviews. And then if and when you do qualify for the ballot, getting out the vote and educating um, members of your community about what you're doing is really important. Most Americans do not know what social housing is. Um, and probably the most critical is to build a broad coalition. So the bad news is that our housing affordability crisis really impacts everyone. The good news is that almost every people-powered organization in your community wants to help build social housing. Racial justice advocates, because high housing costs leads to poverty, which in turn results in higher crime rates in communities. Building walkable, sustainable communities with multifamily housing is much easier to accomplish with social housing. I see folks from Seattle's 350 Seattle, a leading climate action organization, on this call today. They've been critical members of this movement: labor, urbanists, and transit organizations, disability rights, senior citizen rights. Put together a very, very broad coalition. This photo here is from the day in, I think, mid-November, when House Our Neighbors kicked off its field plan for getting out the vote. There are only 3 paid full-time staff at House Our Neighbors. 80 out of the 83 people you see in this photo are members of organizations who each in turn are leveraging dozens of their members to come out and volunteer, knock on doors, make phone calls, table at farmers markets, stand outside grocery stores, and help educate voters about Prop 1A. And if you'd like to learn more about this specific movement, you can go to letsbuildsocialhousing.org. There's a ton of great information there. And I apologize that no one who actually works for House Our Neighbors is here. This is such an amazing women-led organization, and they are very busy right now doing TV interviews, newspaper interviews, knocking on doors, talking to lawyers, and so on. But it's an honor to speak about the awesome work they've done. And I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Sharesh. Great to hear about Seattle. I'm going to open up our question and answer with a question for you, and then we'll turn to the audience for questions. Often when conversations around social housing begin, the question people always ask is, what comes first, the policy or the money? In Seattle, as we learned, the policy came first, and now you're grappling with the options to fund the program. Can you talk about some of the drawbacks and advantages to this approach?
Yeah. So there's ideally, the funding and the creation of the housing developer, public housing developer, go together. Unfortunately, there's some highly technical reasons why House Our Neighbors could not enact it this way. In Washington State, a public development authority can be created with a voter initiative, but public development authorities in Washington State do not have taxing authority. And Washington State has a single subject rule. Voter initiatives must adhere to a single subject. So if the original I-135 had included this progressive tax revenue, it likely would have been challenged in court, even if it had won on the ballot, and could have been completely nullified. So House Our Neighbors took the step of first creating the Public Development Authority, and then following up with a funding measure. And honestly, House Our Neighbors expected our leaders, our elected leaders, to step up and fund it. We have a deeply serious housing crisis. So yeah, that's the reason why it was done this way. And if you visited Seattle and you've been to Pike Place Market, that is a PDA and was created by I think, a voter initiative without any funding source. And then later, I think the funding was passed legislatively.
Thank you so much, Sherez. Okay, now we have some great questions from our participants. The first question is, what is the relationship between social housing and public housing? And how can we bring existing public housing and failing municipal public housing projects along on this vision for social housing?
I could take that question if no one else wants to.
It's
Sure.
yours.
Yeah, so in many ways, social housing is a rebranding of public housing, but it does address many of the key challenges we have with public housing. When our public housing is restricted only to people earning very low incomes, we are racially segregating certain buildings in our city. We are not building integrated communities. And we don't have cross subsidization. We don't have a mix of families living in the building, some with higher incomes and paying higher rents, and some with lower incomes paying lower rents. To be able to make that building self-sustaining, it constantly needs additional public taxpayer funds to stay operating. And as you've seen, I think over the last few decades in America, most public housing projects fall into disrepair because they don't have that self-sustaining income. I don't think I addressed all of the points in that question, but I hope I addressed a couple of the big ones. And I'll maybe also note that the Seattle social housing developer could purchase an existing public housing building that's maybe operated by a nonprofit and slowly convert it to mixed income social housing.
Thank you for that.
If I can jump in here
Please.
too, I want to note that public housing is funded by the federal government, and the thing we're talking about here in Seattle is a municipal level housing program, and we look to federal dollars and federal programs for lots of things, and so like our cities operate various programs on like infrastructure and all sorts of things, and they're funded by the federal government. And then there's sort of this ecosystem that exists for affordable housing. But as Suresh mentioned, there's a lot of problems with the way, and we talked about at the top of this call about the way public housing was designed and the way it operates in our cities. So there hopefully will be this, robust ecosystem that meets the needs of all sorts of folks. And there will be federal funding and there will be local funding to like create this ecosystem. But this is kind of early in an experiment, so we can't say exactly this is how it interacts for sure.
But if I can add to, thanks, Christina. I think what I'd want to add is that big picture, like we see public housing as an important part of the spectrum of social housing, right? Because when we think about how public housing was initially designed, right, before it was underfunded, before it turned into a tool or weapon against communities of color and as a weapon against our communities, there were many principles of social housing that are mentioned in this report that were upheld by public housing. So I think when we think big picture and long term, prioritizing the preservation of public housing, supporting its residents to build more co-governance, strengthening the existing program, right, making it more equitable for the folks who are living in public housing and following their leadership. I think that's a really critical piece of social housing.
Thank you. Thank you. This next question comes from Green New Deal for DC Coalition, which has been advocating for the DC Green New Deal for social housing proposal for the past 2 years. The question is, a roadblock we hit last year was legislators delaying concrete support for this legislation. What are concrete ways to move legislators to approve or vote for proposals like social housing? Anybody want to take that one on?
But I would say there's a reason House Our Neighbors went the voter initiative route. I'll also say that the threat of a voter initiative can push legislators in certain directions. So Seattle was the first large city to pass an increase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour about 10 years ago, and that was due to the threat of a voter initiative. And then also what happens in this progressive bubble in Seattle, once we prove that the sky does not fall when you raise the minimum wage, then it spreads to other communities. And I think we're seeing that with social housing, right? Montgomery County, Atlanta, now just so many places are doing it that hopefully if Seattle's successful, it'll be so much easier to remove those roadblocks in your legislative bodies.
How much organizing did you do around getting this coalition together to get to where you are?
I would give huge credit to Tiffany and Ty, the founders of House Our Neighbors. Most of their energy has gone into coalition building. Um, I spent a year talking to the Building Trades Labor Union Council, right? Bringing in climate action groups, racial justice groups. It's 90% of the work. There's no way a two-person staff can gather 26,000 signatures for a voter initiative, or afford to pay for a lawyer to draft an initiative that can withstand legal challenges. Coalition building is the primary job.
Thank you for that. The next question. Are there any examples of college towns tackling housing, social housing? Bloomington, Illinois, which is home of Indiana University, is dominated by luxury student apartment developers, leaving out low-income students and families.
That might be a question for you.
That is a good question. I think what we've seen in looking at this report, in writing this report, is that a lot of these initiatives exist where there's a robust organizing ecosystem, right? And that whether those are in college towns, I think it really depends on what type of organizing ecosystem there is. Are there tenant unions emerging from buildings where many college students are living and working? Many of the cities that we focus on in this report are home to many colleges and universities, but I don't know enough about their organizing ecosystem to know, is there a chapter of, for example, when we think about a lot of the rent control fights that happen across the country, there are often, as Suresh was saying, the importance of coalition building, right? There are oftentimes many groups of college students who are organizing to get things on the ballot for tenant protections. And so I guess this is not a full answer, but I think it really depends on the organizing ecosystem because that's what fuels these movements. And you'll find it in college towns, and I think it really depends on what issues are really emerging for the students.
Thank you for that, Tram. How could we adapt this model to medium and small size municipalities that may not have the revenue base of Seattle? And what are some alternative financing tools?
I might jump in and say that exclusionary racist zoning laws are at the root of our housing affordability crisis, but it's also wage inequality. So the good news is if you don't have a huge tech industry that you can tax in your local jurisdiction, you have less of that wage inequality that is driving your housing affordability crisis. That said, most municipalities and counties have a fair amount of debt capacity. And so bonding against that capacity to build housing is an option. Those of you know King County, so Seattle is within a county called King County. King County Council member Garmai Zahalai introduced last year a $1 billion workforce housing bonding program, which is effectively a social housing financing program. And so the county really does have that bonding capacity. And that's an option I think I'd suggest you pursue.
Thank you. Our next question is, what other strategies do you recommend for insulating land values from the private market? The public land-based strategies in the report seem to be a helpful avenue, but are there others? In Atlanta, popular development projects drive up land values, especially in low-income communities of color. When we don't strive to insulate when those land values are low, by the time we get an economic will, the financial feasibility is gone.
I could jump in here if y'all like. Uh, uh, I do believe the root cause of this are deeply racist and exclusionary land use laws that said in only tiny parts of most American cities can you build anything other than a house with a yard around it. Those laws were created starting in 1921 specifically to use economic segregation as a proxy for racial segregation. I truly believe the answer is all neighborhoods, particularly the very white and wealthy neighborhoods, should allow the construction of multifamily homes. Um, that I believe will take the pressure off of our historically Black and brown communities and redline communities, where those are the only places right now where you can build those 6-story ugly apartment buildings that tech bros rent studios in for $3,000 a month. Tech
Okay.
bros like me.
I can also, thanks, Suresh. I can also add to that. I think so. There are a few things I'm thinking of. Obviously, if your local government owns any parcels of land, always encourage them to hold on to it. I think a lot of cities and states like to sell it because they can fill some budget gaps, right? If I'm an elected and I'm there for just a few years, would I rather hold on to an empty parking lot or try to fill my budget gap with it, right? They're difficult decisions that have to be made. But we know that when you hold on to a parcel of land, that is something that you generally cannot buy back because, as folks have been saying, the price and value only goes up. So any short-term gain you get is going to be lost when, 20 years from now, what do you know? That neighborhood is full of amenities and would be perfect location for affordable housing. And then other things, I think if we look at land banking as a tool, right, encouraging local entities to, when the market is low, which we're about to kind of hit that time in our boom and bust cycle, when values are low and developers aren't building a ton, that is the time when there's less competition for land and less competition for resources. That's the time to invest in land and property. Whether you're a land trust or a developer, we really have to shift the way that philanthropy, but also budget entities think about when and where to spend, because it's oftentimes in these bus cycles when it's the best use of our dollar, right? We need to get the land now so that we can build while it's still somewhat affordable, though it's never really affordable. And the last thing I'll mention is tenant opportunity to purchase and community opportunity to purchase. Those are really powerful policies that San Francisco and Washington, D.C. have for tenants to be given the opportunity to buy their buildings as a tenant cooperative or assign their rights to an affordable housing developer. Philadelphia just passed a really great policy as well. And I would look to that as a way to remove land from the speculative market. So it doesn't always have to be a public route, though a law that exists can allow private entities like values aligned folks, like nonprofit developers and tenants, to start removing land from the speculative market.
Christina, did I see you had something to add or no?
No, you can move to the next.
Okay. So we've had quite a few questions about relationships between public housing authorities and social housing and the city. Can you explain how we could convert public housing stock to social housing? And what type of control or influence do political actors like the mayor or city council members have on the PDA in Seattle? And where do affordable housing providers enter this landscape?
Yeah, so that's I won't give like a 15-year history of how tech companies spend $20 per vote in every Seattle election to keep their taxes low, and that this is why Housing Neighbors used a voter initiative to create the developer. But I will say Housing Neighbors recognizes that our elected leaders will eventually realize this is a good solution and have a stake in this. So 3 out of the 13 seats on the board of directors of the Seattle Social Housing Developer are appointed by elected leaders, one by the mayor and two by the city council. So they have they are somewhat stakeholders today in in this venture. Um,
Okay.
I can just jump in really quick about the relationship between public housing authorities and a PDA. If you think about your local housing authority, they engage in partnerships, well, public-private partnerships with all sorts of developers. They lend their tax status to a corporate developer to redevelop housing and all sorts of other ways, which we talk about in the report. But if we could think about a social housing developer or a public housing developer, as someone said, this is an incredibly important part of social housing. If we can think about them engaging in partnerships that allow for like building social housing, maybe passing it along to a social housing developer, or utilizing federal funds that they get and leveraging them for the purposes of making housing perpetually affordable. And I will say that this crew that brought you this toolkit is thinking about and working on some resources around financing next. So look out for that this year.
Thank you. I love that people can stay in housing even if their income increases. How were the negotiations with the city housing developer in order to establish these terms?
So that might be a question. I'm not sure if it's specific to Seattle since they have program guidelines, but they don't have they're not operating any housing right now. That is something that we talked about in the report in terms of a principle for income targeting and cost burden. And so the question is about negotiating those terms. That's really going to depend on the governance structures that exist in the social housing program or policy that is designed. So it's very much a product of like what organizers and the relationship between organizers and electeds who design this program, right? Where they end up in terms of shaping the guidelines. But it can be done.
Thank you. Last question. What was the strategic narrative that was used to get community members to support I-135? And if there was any not in my backyard opposition, how was it dealt with?
so it's very difficult. It's far harder to pass I-135 than it has been to advocate for I-137, the tax. Most people don't know the word social housing. We are fortunate that we've had people run for office in 2019. Sean Scott, a Black abolitionist, ran for city council on the platform of social housing. And while he lost by just a couple thousand votes, he educated voters a little bit about what social housing is. Nikita Oliver, a racial justice advocate who single-handedly carried Seattle through the George Floyd protests, also ran for city council and advocated for social housing. And while they lost, they educated voters a little bit about social housing. So by the time Housing Neighbors came together, some of that work had been done, but it was lots of really long conversations, very, very difficult. 5 minutes to get someone to sign a voter initiative saying, okay, it's not public housing, it's social housing. No, it won't be built in your backyard. It'll be built just anywhere that an apartment can be built. We can't change zoning rules with a voter initiative in Washington State. Lots of op-eds, lots of TV interviews, just a ton of work on educating people. Hopefully, you don't have to do that in your communities. What we do in Seattle spreads around the country, and we're seeing it. You know, you've listed so many communities now in the U.S. that are starting social housing programs.
All right. Well, I'm going to wrap us up, but I want to thank you for the conversation today. For folks that didn't get their questions answered, we'll follow up with you after the fact. And as we close out of this space today, I want to put up a few questions for you to take with you as you engage in these conversations within your own communities. How can social housing policies be designed to solve housing issues that pre-existing policies can't? How is the real estate state currently influencing government in your jurisdiction? And how can social housing shift the power dynamic towards a community-led development ecosystem? Also, we didn't get to everyone today, but we encourage you to engage with the report and feel free to reach out if you have follow-up questions. We'll be sending out this recording of this briefing next week. Thank you and have a good one. Take care, everyone.